주의 모습 들지는 니달리지 가오라쇼 양말라고 참바나 참바다다 진주 충주에 다소 직매 마음이나 내라 동오라쇼 근사람의 양마와 지바게 보게매 일로 유시람에나 마다 소마 제브라쇼 미다 군레 달와나 대다 시라 세대지 세다 제바 근존에 다도 세라 제브라쇼 Tamje namba zushe do longje cheba me prajo Zeba me je tsime ba rawa dune je prajo Simje si je chuma ba deda si je je prajo Bata jenga suge ba so sa be so so prajo Jine burme chinye ba deda je ba ni jo je Mara namne to do je ma je da ja je prajo Dage sunam diye ne simje tamje ma le ba Dikpa tamje Pangme ne tato ge wa che prajo Changzhe semla me zhe Changzhe she la she wa na Sanje nam ye yo so she De ge me jia bong wa Semje de ta tamje ne Tsen ya pang me le wa she Tato ge vra su jure she Chi we ta ya ta ma Pa son shi ge je me sa Sanje ta ne sanje se Che ye zho pe kong wa ye Che na tamje kong wa Tamje de de sa she da se ma da sa me pa ta Ma te ta nya me tru ya ra she jam pa ne jro je Ko je jen kro ye kro ya chang che se pa mong po Rang ye le pe sa te na je pra se pe shu jro je Pe je ko je cha ta ne shin da we se tam je Nam ga le ya che je cha ju me che pa ta pra shu Te ta ta to san je na san je se ta che je Chebe jimbo taye me trove la ma chebe shu Naya biso chebe shen lo to biso tso chru Jabo shu shen cheba dan jiten da kya da wa shu Menam tu dan tenpa dan sama de je jubra shu Kanjo simbo la so ba ninje simba de je Simje gaya tu ma ju diba ma ju na ma ju Jida nyebra mi ju shen gaya ime de ma ju Sula kana lo pa da kade je je le ne shu Tabla ge de tempa da ge de te ya jubra shu La pa de be ge mo da tempa da kya jubra shu Ye wa tam je pa ne ne sim ne le ra bom je je Ge lo ma na ge de she ta da tempa bom ra shu De she ra do chung wa ge su jin yang pa mi ju Su jin cha we yi jang ne ta do de pa se je shu De zhe da ne to ju ne de yang to shu mi yang Ke pa nam ne korwa da se nyo da ja ne pra shu Ju ne yo so da pa da chun na kun to cha pra Ye so dong ha mi nyong shen ka wa che pa me pa yang La we la pe le to ne de da san je nyo do shu Sim je kun je le ma do san je tam je shu ji San je de wa sam ye ge da do de da de ju ji Chang she sem pa nam je ne zhong de to la gong ju Gong bo ye ne kang gong ma sem je nam la de ju ji De she la san ye nam da ye de nam jan de ju ji Da jan jam yang ka jin je sa ra ka wa to brang ju Da do se ra jen pa da ram to chung wa je pra shu Da ne ka se chi ne jan nyam da de je so wa shu Sera kundo we ne ma me zo te pa to pra shu Kan se ta ran de pa am chung se chi wa de na yang Gong bo jam yang de nye ne 他说大眼的呀，现对哪的，现对哪，都
We
是
will begin with the opening prayers. Please raise your hands if you can hear me.
dene gwendikage genduma nambada. Dena shingi chalam tone.
So I'd like to welcome all the monks and nuns from the monasteries in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, everyone participating in listening on the web, as well as all our friends and family who are listening over the internet. I'd like to offer you my greetings. So today is the 6th day of our teaching. So what I'd like to speak about today is how the other day we spoke about how the Vedic period is divided into two sections, the early Vedic period and the late Vedic period. So today we are discussing the late Vedic period. And even with this late Vedic period, in order to be able to explain it, I've broken it up into three parts. And so this has been my plan and these three parts are, first of all, please look at this. So there's the three section parts of the Vedic period are the four Vedas, the Brahmanical period, and then the age of philosophy. So these are the three parts of it that I'm discussing. And the reason to divide into three parts is, as I described the other day, it is not chronological. It is not in terms of time. Instead, it is in terms of the contents or meaning or the composition of the three different types of the Brahmanical literature. And so I'd like to ask you to please keep that in mind. And now, so today, among these three sections, yesterday we spoke about the four Vedas and the philosophies related to them. So we talk about the four Vedas. The first was the Rig Veda, right? The Rig Veda was not written down initially. It was instead transmitted by oral recitation. And then gradually, it was written down. So after the Rig Veda was written down, the other three Vedas were also written down. And the other three Vedas are during the time when the other three Vedas were being written down. And because of them being written down, then the Brahmanical civilization flourished greatly in India. The Brahmanical civilization or the Brahmanical knowledge took the view of the Vedas as like it's a basis, or it's like its mother. And then their practice was to preserve this. Now, during the Brahmanical period, the main texts, there are several main texts that appeared during that period. And so here I'm showing you, if you look at this diagram I'm showing you can see the Brahmana. So that here you can see the word Brahmana. So there. This is the Brahmana, the text name, the Brahmana. Then there was the text of the forest dwellers, Aryanaka. So in Sanskrit, it's called the Aryanaka, the texts of the forest dwellers. And then the Upanishads. And then there are the great epics, the Kavya. So now I would like to give you an introduction to the texts called the Brahmanas. Now, in order to speak about the Brahmanas, we need to speak a little bit about the background and the content of the Brahmanas. So in this time, people had a great interest and desire to perform the offering rituals. In fact, there are even some who took no interest in doing anything else. They did no other work, and they only performed rituals. And so for that reason, because there's a number of Brahmas, so later they were called Brahmins, but at that time there are the priests who performed the rituals. The number of these priests increased greatly. And at the same time as their number increased, at the same time, their power naturally also spread and grew greater. So during that period, those who were doing rituals wanted to show off their own qualities to others. And so for that reason, they made the rituals more complex and more elaborate. And so the offering rituals then became, so in order that they had even greater meaning, so they had greater symbolic meaning, they made a lot of different efforts. They tried hard to make them more meaningful. So the period of the Rig Veda and the period when the Brahmanas were different in terms of their situations. And the difference is that earlier during the period of the Rig Veda, is that everyone had primarily emphasized having faith and belief in the gods. But during the time of the Brahmanas, people started taking interest only in the rituals and to see whether they could practice. And this is what they were concerned with. And so for that reason, whether the people who were performing the rituals or the populace, they were interested only in the rituals and only considered the rituals to be important. And so the rituals themselves became very, in terms of their external appearance, in order that they became more, they primarily took interest in making the rituals themselves seem more externally elaborate and more complex. And so in the end, it was as if they forgot the inner meaning. They forgot about the gods, and because they were so interested in the external form of the rituals, that in the end, it's as if they forgot that there were gods, that they were just completely deceived into thinking only about the rituals. And so what the people of this time thought so that everything that moved in the world and everything in the world was related to their sacrificial rituals. So this is how they thought. And so the sacrificial rituals became absolutely indispensable. They were like the meaning of life. They're the most important. People recognize them as being the most important part of their lives. So in this sort of an environment, because there are so many complicated rituals, that they took notes on the rituals, on how to practice them, and the different methods of performing them. And these are recorded in what are called the Brahmanas. So if we were to use the Buddha's terminology to explain it, then the four Vedas are like the words of the Buddha. And the Brahmanas are like the treatises that explain the meaning. Oh, another way of explaining it is that the four Vedas are like the parent or the basis of the performing the rituals, and the texts that explain how to do that are called by the name the Brahmanas. Now, if we think about the meanings of the Brahmanas, to introduce the meaning of the Brahmanas, first of all of the gods who are described in the earlier Vedic texts were like the nature gods, the sun and the moon and the heaven and the earth. These were considered to be gods, and people viewed them as gods. So that's how people thought in the early Vedic period. And that gradually changed. And during the time of the Brahmana texts, instead of thinking of the gods as being like manifestations of nature, they thought of them as being a more abstract gods. For example, like a creator god. And so there's appearance of the creator god, and there's also a god of prayer, as we mentioned yesterday. And all of these there's no natural thing you could point out and say this is the god, but instead it's like the abstract idea, and to think of that and thinking that there is a god, and so it's like a projection saying there is this god. Similarly, it's not only that. During the time when the Brahmanas were appearing, another change that occurred is that even the gods who previously had not been important gods eventually were transformed into human gods. So in brief, the main point is that at the time that the Brahmanas appeared, it was different than during the early Vedic period. And all the people were more like humans, as they explained it. Similar, when you say that they're more human-like, that in the past, the gods were someone who were superior, who were very powerful. And their gods had a character that it was different than humans, and a nature that it was different than humans. However, later, during the time of the Brahmanical texts, then the gods also ended up having more of a human character, and they had they appeared more like ordinary people. It was kind of like the imprints of humans in them, and they also, in their character, they also had great flaws in their behavior. As I said before, when you look at the Vedic literature, they're the gods. As I described, there were people who always wanted bakshish. They always wanted. There are people who are always taking offerings. These weren't just any old gods. So like I mentioned yesterday, it's like Varuna, who is the god who oversaw the rules, and you're also giving him the bakshish. And so many stories about this as well, right? And so many similar stories. And so even in their behavior, their gods had great flaws. And so this also began in that time. And the reason why this happened, if we just hypothesize, is that before, during the time when the Vedas were appearing, is the gods were at such a high level and so powerful. They're so too high and they're too powerful. And so people didn't really have a feeling of them being close to us. What ordinary people is something that's going to benefit them directly, something that's related to their daily lives, and that's going to give them a practical benefit. For example, if we speak about it, when you say the three jewels, people say, oh, yes, the three jewels are important, but in terms when it comes to practical things, they think it's better to make offerings to the worldly gods and the spirits. And many people think this, right? And if we say it just to put it bluntly. So the three jewels are just like too huge. They're too powerful. And so we ordinary people, in our minds, we're not really able to recognize what they are. But when you talk about worldly spirits, like we make them an offer, we think that there is some sort of an immediate benefit that's going to come. And so for among the public, then when you think about the local spirits and deities and gods and so forth, and they think that they're more important than the three jewels. So it's similar. At that time, and many of the gods had changed from how they were before. And also many new gods appeared. To give an example, one example is that in the Vedas, there's a god named Rudra. If we translate it into English, that would be the wrathful god. Now, Rudra was originally the storm god. He was considered a god about strong storms. And so this was Rudra, right? So Rudra was recognized as a god who was destructive and who everyone should be afraid of. And he gradually turned into the form of Ishvara. And later, once he'd become a form of Ishvara, he was an object of people's faith. And so this god, great Mahashvara, Ishvara, he basically appeared probably during this period of the Brahmana period. Before that, there hadn't been any Ishvara. There was the Rudra, but the Ishvara, whom we consider one of the three great gods, had not previously been present and only appeared during the times of the Brahmana texts. It is explained. Now, the second god is, as we talk about the great god or Mahadeva. Now, this god, Mahadeva, also appeared during this era. Now, there are many Brahmana texts, actually. It's not just one text. There are many texts. So the Brahmanas are just one text. There are many texts that are called the Brahmanas. And in one of these particular texts, the god Mahadeva is identified as being the most important and the greatest of the gods. And later, Mahadeva also became a synonym for the god great Ishvara. And so this is also another change. Now, another sort of change that happened is there are two Brahmana texts. And the names of these two texts, I can't really say the names exactly what they are, but these two texts in these two texts, there are two separate stories. There are many legends in the Brahmanas, and one of these legends is one that we often study when we study poetry. There's a story of Vishnu being exiled of Vishnu exiling the demigod named Topten down under the ground beneath the earth, and by doing this, he gained control over half of the earth. And then once again, then after that, he made the effort to gain control over the entire universe. And so there's that legend there. And also in another Shatapatha, another Brahmana, there is a story that Vishnu had the greatest powers of all. But there is a story that Indra, that he took Vishnu's head. So there's another legend about that. So basically, in the Brahmanas, they made up all sorts of stories about the gods. Now, some of them had previously been for. These are real myths, and some were probably just all sorts of myths that are put together and made up. And so it's a question of saying what actually was and what isn't is very difficult. It's hard to distinguish the two. And so it became very complicated. However, there are a great deal of stories and legends in the Brahmanas that are related to the gods. When you think about the Hindu or the Brahmana religion, there are so many gods. How did all these gods arise? What were their roles? What were their particular functions? And they also need to explain all the things and all the appearances of the world that are related to the gods. And so there had to be many stories and legends to explain all of these. In any case, among all these legends, some of these that were ancient stories that had previously existed, and some were newly composed. In any case, whether or not they were true, if we look at them, there are many amazing and inspiring legends. But we don't have time to go through them all. But I would like to speak like one of the most well-known and famous of these tales. So the most well-known myth is the myth of Manu. Now, the myth of Mana, the myth of Manu is described in many ways in different Hindu texts, but fundamentally they're the same. So Manu is described in the Vedic literature as being the ancestor of all people, the first human. So Manu, the meaning of the word itself is human or man. So Manu was the ancestor of all humans. Now, there's also, in Christianity, there's the Old Testament. There is the story of Noah, and this is very similar to the myth of Manu. So Manu, the story of Manu is that Manu was a human. And this guy named Manu, so one day he went to wash his hands, and this fish came up to him. So the fish in the water came up to him and he says, "You please take care of me. And please give me food and take care of me," he said. "And one day I'm going to do something to help you." And so the fish said this to Manu. And so Manu listened to what the fish was saying and took care of the fish, and gradually the fish became really big. And one day, all of a sudden, the fish said to Manu, "So in a few years, there are going to be huge floods. There's going to be a huge flood. And when this flood happens, if you listen to me, and you need to make a boat. So make the boat now. Get it ready now. It's good to get it ready now." So Manu, he listened to the fish, and he made the boat, and he got ready. And so one day, then actually, the flood actually came. When the great flood came, then Manu immediately, he'd already gotten ready. He'd gotten a boat and he sat in the boat. And once he was in the boat, then the fish at that point came and the fish pulled the boat and brought them past across the northern mountains and then came to a tree. And they came underneath a tree. And when they reached this tree, they stayed there then. And they had to wait until the flood subsided. And so when the flood waters had all subsided, then Manu himself got out of the boat and he looked around. All the animals had died, all the beings had died. All the living creatures had died. There was no one left but him. Since he was the only one left, and so Manu thought to himself, well, he needed to have offspring and descendants. But he was only there, so there's no way he could have children. So there's no way to have children. What did he need to do? So he needed to pray to the gods. And he performed many rituals in order to please the god. And he went gods, and he went through a lot of hardship and difficulties and worked hard. And then one day, a woman came out of the ocean. And this woman's name was Ila. Now, this woman named Ila comes out of the ocean, and when she says to Manu is, now if you make a sacrifice of me, if you recognize there's something to be offered and make an offering of me, then all the humans and all the livestock will come from you, and you will have a human life. And so Manu did as this woman said. He followed her directions, and in the end, he had offspring and he had descendants, and that's how we human descendants. So we are all descendants of Manu. So to put it safe, all humans arose from this human. All these humans arose from Manu, so Manu is our ancestor. So this story is very similar to the story of Noah's Ark that is written in Hebrew. Now, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's very similar to that story. Likewise, there is a similar story of a great flood in China. So in English, we call it the Great Flood. It is such a story. Basically, all over the world, there are similar myths. But in so many different parts of the world, it's different than it is today. It is very difficult to get from one place to another. And they weren't near to each other. They're like neighbors. It's like in places from the west to the east, they had the very similar myths that occur. And so what is the reason why we have such similar myths? And whether the story actually happened, and if it did happen, where did it happen? These things are difficult to say. Perhaps, and think about it, perhaps there was a great flood in the world in the time of our distant ancestors. And then they were able to, and they're probably they had to cross an ocean, and probably most people perished, and there were only a few people left. And perhaps this is possible that it happened. But in any case, there is such a story, the story of Manu. And it's a very well-known myth. And so here I'm showing this picture. So now here, there are many other people, there are rishis and so forth. And the 7 rishis. Now, I think the question of the 7 rishis or the 7 sages occurred earlier. And actually, in the story of Manu, there was only Manu. There wasn't anyone else. But later, the myth kind of changed. And so the seven sages are also, because the Brahmins thought the sages were important, so they had to put themselves in this situation, right? It's possible that this happened. So that's how it is. Now, if we're to speak a little bit about the philosophies that developed during the time that developed from the Brahmanas, there are several philosophies that came from the Brahmanas, but these philosophies are not philosophies that began from the wish to investigate the actual nature. Instead, they primarily took the sacrificial offerings as their basis and then described the reasons for that. They spoke about the important symbolic meanings, the important meanings of the sacrifices. And in order to show that the sacrifices have meaning, they developed several philosophies. Now, when I talk about these philosophies, if we talk about it really strictly, they aren't really actual philosophies. The philosophies of that time, as I said, in the end of the Rig Veda, it says there's a story that's saying that all phenomena is one in essence, for it's similar here. So these are like speaking about how things related to the sacrificial offerings have a great meaning. In order to show that great meaning, to make them more impressive, there's a little bit of an explanation of the nature, but it wasn't like it was later, where there was a great philosophical presentation and a great explanation of the views. Now, generally, when we're talking about the text of the Brahmanas, what many people, there are different ways that people are thinking about it. There are different styles of thought. Now, some of these were at a very high philosophical level, and some of it, in the way we ordinate, I think we think explaining things on a very high philosophical level. And even if there's not a whole lot of meaning, but in terms of the words, they're actually very impressive words. In any case, in the Brahmanas, there are many different topics and words and citations and logic that actually can give us all a headache. But basically, the way their manner of thinking and the style of their logic, they're basically all essentially the same. There's not a whole lot that should really surprise or amaze us. And so for that reason, the later German scholar Sanskritologist who I mentioned the other day, named Deussen, and the way he appraised it as, there are many, but only a few, he said. And so as he said this, in the Brahmanas, the philosophies, the way they saw them, in the Brahmanas, the way they saw them, the philosophies they developed there are so many of them. They say a lot of things, but what comes down to the main points, the things that actually have any significance, or things, the philosophies that actually really stand out, there are just a few of them, actually. So he said there were many, but only a few. This is kind of like a kind of a really pointed summary of the Brahmana texts. So this is probably, we will now take a half-hour break, and then we will continue with the teaching.
ne jiro te se da ne jiro